Thank you for coming to White Oak Church of God's Tabernacle in the Wilderness. We hope this will be an experience that you will always remember. First, we would like to tell you a little bit about the Bible and how we get to the Tabernacle in the Wilderness. So I will give you a very brief summary from Genesis to Exodus 25, where the Tabernacle in the Wilderness began. Then, you will be guided and taken through our life-size replica of the Tabernacle in the Wilderness. Everything is not specifically to scale, but we got as close as we could in hopes of giving you a good picture to start with, and perhaps you will even study it further after you leave here today. After you have toured the Tabernacle, then we just ask you to stay with us for 5 more minutes to give you a brief explanation as to where Jesus comes into the picture. Easter will be Sunday, March 19th, and we want to show you the reason why Jesus was God's ultimate and perfect sacrifice through this tabernacle experience. Let's begin. We'd like to take you on a journey through a portion of the Old Testament in the Bible. We'll begin with the book of Genesis. In Genesis, you will find the story of Adam and Eve and how sin came into our lives. You will find out about the family bloodline of Adam. In Genesis 4, you start to see how the Lord regretted making humans because of how evil they had become. So he decided to destroy everything and everyone with a flood. However, a man named Noah found favor with God. So he was instructed by God to build an ark so he could stay safe during the flood. The flood wiped out everything. After the flood, Noah built an altar and sacrificed some of the animals up unto God. God said he would never again destroy the earth by flood, and he gave us his promise by giving us the rainbow. Noah and his sons were blessed and multiplied. We see his family tree grow and grow. Then we get to the Tower of Babel, when God spread the people over the earth and developed many languages. Then the story talks about a man named Abram. God instructed Abram to leave his home and to go to a land where God promised to make him a leader of many nations. So Abram did as God requested. As Abram traveled, each time he stopped to camp, he would make an altar unto the Lord. In Genesis 17, God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means the father of many nations. Abraham was married and had a child named Isaac. God tested Abraham by instructing Abraham to sacrifice Isaac unto God. But when God saw Abraham's obedience, God provided another sacrifice instead. Isaac built an altar unto the Lord, and the Lord blessed his family. Isaac married and had a son named Jacob. Jacob married and had a son named Joseph. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. In Genesis 35, Israel built an altar unto God. Israel had 12 sons, and they lived in a place called Canaan. Joseph was Israel's favorite son, which made his other sons jealous. So they decided to sell Joseph to be a slave to Potiphar, who was captain of the king's palace in Egypt. Joseph found favor with the king, and the Lord blessed Joseph. Joseph became the king's right-hand man. Egypt was in a famine, which meant there was no food. But Joseph came up with an idea that would help keep the people fed for the years that they were under the famine. Joseph's father, Israel, sent his sons to Egypt to get food. And guess who they ran into? Joseph. Remember, These were the brothers that sold Joseph to be a slave. But Joseph was nice to them and forgave them, and they were all reunited. With the king's blessing, Joseph moved his father Israel and all of the Israelites to Egypt to be with him. Many years later, Israel died, and then Joseph and all his brothers died, and a new king was ruling in Egypt. The new king felt like there were too many Israelites in Egypt, so he decided to make them all slaves. The king declared that if the Israelites had any baby boys, he would have them thrown into the Nile River. The king's daughter was in the Nile River and found a baby boy floating down the Nile, and she took him in and raised him as her own and named him Moses. Moses grew up and one day saw an Egyptian beating a slave, so Moses killed the Egyptian. When the king found out what Moses had done, he wanted to kill Moses. So Moses ran away to a city called Midian, where he met Jethro, who was a priest. Moses married Jethro's daughter, and later the mean king died and the Israelites were still slaves in Egypt. So they cried out to God for help. Moses was out tending to his sheep when an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a burning bush. God told Moses to go to Egypt and convince the king of Egypt to let his people go. God knew the king would not let them go so easily. So he gave Moses powers to use, and he told him to take his brother Aaron to help him. Each time Moses went before the king, he would ask the king to let God's people go, but the king would not. And he even made it worse for the slaves. So God brought catastrophes and plagues onto Egypt. Once, while Aaron was speaking to the king, Aaron's rod became a serpent. God grew angry with the king and responded with plagues of frogs, insects, cattle diseases, boils on the people, plagues of hail, locusts, and darkness. The last plague was known as the Lord's Passover. This was when God instructed the Israelites to take an unblemished lamb and take some of its blood, smear the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of the homes of the Israelites. That night, the Lord's Spirit passed over the homes, and if you had the blood on your doorpost, then you were safe. But if you didn't, then the firstborn in the house, whether child or animal, would be killed. When the king's firstborn son died, he told Moses and Aaron to take the Israelites and leave Egypt. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. God started instructing them what they needed to do. God told them that every firstborn child and animal belonged to him. He told them when they should eat and when they should celebrate. God was leading the Israelites back to Canaan, but he took them through the wilderness up to the Red Sea. After the Israelites had left Egypt, the king had a change of heart and gathered his army and chased after the Israelites. As the Egyptians were catching up to the Israelites near the Red Sea, God instructed Moses how to cross the Red Sea, and they were able to get to the other side of the Red Sea safely. The Egyptians were following them, but God closed the Red Sea and killed all the Egyptians. The Lord continued to lead Moses and the Israelites out into the wilderness. As the Israelites traveled through the wilderness, they started complaining because they wanted water, bread, and meat. So Moses would ask the Lord, and God would provide. While Moses and the Israelites were traveling through the wilderness, they ran into Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. Jethro gave counsel to Moses and helped him set up leaders and judges within the Israelite community to help settle disputes. As the Israelites were traveling into the wilderness of Sinai, they set up camp. There was a mountain called Mount Sinai. Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. God gave Moses several laws for the people to obey. God instructed them when to work and when they should rest. He instructed them about a lot of things and was very specific in how things should be done. Moses remained on the mountaintop with God for 40 days and 40 nights, writing down all of God's instructions. Now we are finally at Exodus 25, where God told Moses that he wanted the people of Israel to build him a sacred place, like a sanctuary or tabernacle. Remember that they were in the wilderness by Mount Sinai at the time God instructed them to have the Israelites bring offerings to him of gold, silver, and bronze. He asked for blue, purple, and red material, fine linen, goat hair for cloth, tanned ram skins and goat skin leather, acacia wood and olive oil for the lamps, spices for the anointing oil and fragrant incense, and several items and pieces of furniture. Now we are ready to take you into the tabernacle in the wilderness.